The history of the Jewish people began more than 3,000 years ago. In the desert, an idea developed of the one and only God, one who tolerates no other gods but him. Monotheism was an idea that would change the world. War and persecution scattered the Jews all around the world. It is a story of splendor and suffering that leads right up to the present day. They've left their mark as great thinkers, scientists, and artists. How did the Jews manage to maintain their identity over all these years? The Jews, History of a People. Part 2, Diaspora. The Romans ruled Judea. The king they installed, Herod, has died. Revolts break out. Herod had unified the kingdom, but now Rome divides the state. Jerusalem is in unrest. Religious parties are arguing about the occupation. At the temple, the most sacred place in the city, the different views clash. Many hope for the Messiah, a saviour promised by God. He will, so they believe, end this foreign rule and finally bring about eternal peace. Criticism of both the Roman occupation and the Jewish upper class and their relationship to religion is becoming louder. In particular, for devout Jews, the goings-on outside the temple are an affront to God. In the eyes of his followers, the preacher Jesus is the Messiah. For the Romans, he is a rabble-rouser. They crucify him. Nobody suspects that his death is the birth of a new world religion, closely linked with the fate of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, Jesus is representative of the whole history of Christian anti-Judaism, because it was assumed that he was the Son of God, and the notion of his being the Messiah plays a central role in Christianity. Coupled with the rejection of Jesus by Judaism that says Jesus is not the Messiah, that naturally leads to this long history of Christian anti-Judaism that persists to this day. Crucifixion is a common form of punishment that the Romans use against tiresome rabble-rousers, but the early Christians don't blame the Romans for the death of Jesus, they blamed the Jewish people. For them, Judas Iscariot becomes the embodiment of the greedy traitor, and gradually he comes to be seen as the embodiment of the Jew, plain and simple. To this day, the fabricated caricature serves them as justification for their hostility to the Jews. That Jesus was a Jew himself is conveniently forgotten. A few decades later, the Zealots, a radical religious group, have taken over the power in Jerusalem. They want to liberate the land from the Romans. For 2 years, Roman legions besieged the city where refugees from the entire region are hiding out. Only gravediggers are allowed to leave Jerusalem. In order to prevent the spread of disease, the dead are buried outside of the city walls. This time they're transporting a special load. The wise Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai has passed away, they claim, and their sorrow is immense. At this time, hardly anyone still believes in the victory of the Jewish rebels. The superiority of the Roman enemy is just too great. The further fate of the rabbi is recounted by a Jewish legend. So it happened that Yohanan ben Zakkai managed to escape from Jerusalem alive in a wooden coffin. The rabbi isn't out to save his own life, but the faith and the knowledge of his people, his memories and his hopes. He's planning a new religious center far away from the besieged metropolis. If Jerusalem is lost, at least the spirit of Jewry must have a new home. A little while later, the Romans occupy the city and destroy the temple. The Jewish chronicler Flavius Josephus writes, "The Temple Mount seemed to glow from the ground up because it was surrounded by fire, but even fuller than the river of flames were the rivers of blood that were flowing." The West Wall, also called the Wailing Wall, supported the Temple Plateau. Angels, so it was told by a Jewish legend, held their wings over it during the destruction of the temple. It is both a place for pilgrims and a synagogue. For centuries, Jews from all over the world have been attaching notes with wishes and prayers to the wall. The symbolic power and the connection of modern Jewry with the Jewry of ancient times, for that the West Wall is a connecting link between the old Jewish state and the new Jewish state, the worldwide Diaspora. And I think this West Wall can't leave a single Jew in the whole world entirely cold, never mind how undevout or secular they say they are. Everyone who has ever been there or who is standing in front of this West Wall will start saying a prayer or perhaps even attaching a note to the wall.
Und vielleicht sogar auch einen Zettel in die Mauer zu stecken.
Today too, those praying repeat the psalm. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. For most Jews, Jerusalem will always stay alive in their hearts. The chronicler Flavius Josephus reports that the Romans take 97,000 Jewish prisoners. Many end up on the imperial slave markets. The Roman Emperor Titus celebrates his victory with a triumphal procession through Rome. He's carrying the stolen temple treasures, the menorah, the seven-branched candelabra, and the trombones with him. The Arch of Titus in Rome commemorates this event. The monument is a triumphal arch and a warning at the same time. To this day, Jews refuse to pass through it. But what happened to the temple treasures? Flavius Josephus writes that the price of gold fell by 50% in the Middle East. That's how much Titus stole in Jerusalem. Scholars suspect that Emperor Vespasian and his son financed expensive buildings in Rome with the booty. As Jerusalem falls, Yohanan ben Zakkai and his retinue are traveling to the Mediterranean coast. They intend to found the new religious center in the small town of Yavne. Here they want to make the Torah the focal point of studies and teaching. Soon Yavne comes close to the importance of Jerusalem. There are only speculations about the exact location of the religious academy. Since 2005, a team from Bar Ilan University has been systematically looking for remains. Amongst them is Avi Solomon, and he has a big dream. It's the dream of an archaeologist and a devout Jew. Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai renewed Judaism in Yavne. The religion that was organized around the temple became the religion that longed for the temple. That's why it'd be a big thing for me if after 2,000 years of diaspora and exile, I could find this place again where the tradition of this new form of the religion began.
אם אחרי 2,000 שנות גלות אני אוכל לחזור למקום שבו התחילה המסורת של הגלות, בשבילי זה היה הדבר הגדול ביותר.
Yohanan ben Zakkai implements far-reaching reforms. He abolishes animal sacrifice, which has been the custom in the temple. Communal prayer and the study of the Torah take its place. The menorah becomes the symbol for the holy city of Jerusalem and the lost temple. Some mosaics of the time are now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. They decorated the floors of ancient synagogues. That's the name given to the Jews' places of congregation, in which they also commemorate their history. In Gamla, in the Golan Heights, archaeologists found one of Israel's earliest synagogues. After the fall of Jerusalem, many Jews fled to this inhospitable area. The form of the hall, the multi-leveled rows of benches and the structure of the columns are typical of synagogues dating back to this time. They're oriented towards Jerusalem, the holy city. Such houses of congregation already existed before the destruction of the temple, but now their significance changed.
After the destruction, the synagogue gained a new meaning, a new purpose. And that purpose was the center for a new kind of worship. Prayer, of course, had always existed on an individual level, mostly spontaneous, but the rabbis sought to create a fixed sort of prayer, an obligatory prayer, which would take place at very specific times of day. And the rabbis themselves say quite explicitly that the prayers are meant to replace the sacrifices that were brought at the same times in the temple.
To this day, the communal prayer is of great significance. A service can only take place when at least 10 men are present. Only then is the presence of God, the Shekinah, guaranteed. Any place could be a synagogue if Jews come together with a Torah for prayer. After the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, the survivors flee right to the edge of the desert, into the vicinity of the Dead Sea. Herod had erected the fortress Masada on the huge rock plateau. It was considered unassailable for a long time. Already during the siege of Jerusalem, Jewish rebels had locked themselves into the mountain. It is their last haven. Rome sends 8,000 legionaries to Masada. The floor plans of their camps are still recognizable today. The Jerusalem archaeologist Guy Stiebel is fascinated by the dramatic history of the siege of Masada. According to the Jewish chronicler Flavius Josephus, the siege ends in tragedy.
The Jews were here after 7 years or 8 years of fighting in Judea. They knew what happened in Jerusalem. They knew what happened in Jodapata, at Gamla and other places. So they could not be optimistic. And when you realize that, it can actually lead you to the understanding of why they were thinking about committing suicide. I mean, as a possibility. Whether it happened or not, there's still a debate. But you can see the mood, the way of thinking.
For 3 years, the besieged hold out. From above, they can closely watch all of the Roman actions and hear their voices. The Romans force Jewish prisoners to build a huge ramp. Then they roll the battering ram up and attack the wall of the fortress. The discoveries of the archaeologists corroborate this part of the story as recounted by the chronicler Josephus. But the final scenes of the drama lie in the dark. Did the rebels really draw lots for the 11 men that killed nearly 1,000 others before they killed themselves? What is truth and what is heroic legend? Because so far archaeologists have only recovered 32 skeletons. Guy Stiebel is hoping for new insights into the days before the showdown. A large proportion of the finds are stored in the University of Jerusalem. Among them, 700 ostraka, inscribed clay shards. 11 of them have names. Are these the lots Flavius Josephus writes about? It is certainly true that the name of Ben Jair is written on one of them, the name of the rebel leader.
For me, the most exciting, I may say even emotional, discoveries that are being made at Masada are the inscriptions, and the fact that we have so many of them here, written in Hebrew, written here 2,000 years ago. And I think that if we speak about continuation, some in the 60s referred to as a resurrection of the dry bone, literally, such a fragment was actually found here. The fact that Jewish people came back to this land. So if you want to demonstrate the continuation, this string of life, if you wish, is for me is the fact that both my boys can read Hebrew letters that were written 2,000 years ago.
Masada is a symbol of the Jews' perseverance. Here they believe with particular conviction in the recreation of Israel as it is prophesied in the Bible. Particularly during the 1940s, Jews were drawn to this mysterious place. Some had survived the Holocaust in Europe. They too left inscriptions for future generations. And to this day, Israeli soldiers pledge in their swearing in, Masada must never be allowed to fall again. In 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian put down the last revolt of the Jews. After the destruction of the temple, the Romans had already had coins stamped with the inscription Judea Capta, Judea captured. Now they destroy Jerusalem completely and erect a new city. They rename the province of Judea Syria Palestina. Jews are prohibited from settling in this land. Many flee to already established communities. The Roman historian Strabo writes, "The last are already in nearly every city on earth, and it's not easy to find a place on this earth that doesn't house this people." Some stay in northern Palestine, close to their holy city. Bet Shirim in Galilee becomes the spiritual magnet in this region. It is possibly the site of the once famous yeshiva, the academy of Rabbi Judah Hanassi. Many scholars and students come to study the Torah.
זוהי דרך ישרה שיעבור לו האדם. כל שהיא תפארת לעושיה ותפארת לו מן האדם. והווה זהיר.
Judah Hanassi also taught oral traditions. They have been handed down for generations. At the beginning of the 3rd century, Abba ben Avihu arrives in Bet Shirim. He comes from an important family in Babylon. His ancestry goes back to King David. Judah Hanassi becomes his teacher with a great goal. The time is coming when people will look for and not find guidance in the Torah, when they will look for and not find the teachings of the learned. Many answers to questions of everyday life are still only handed down orally. Together with his students, Judah Hanassi begins to write down the so-called oral Torah. What is created is the Mishnah, a compilation of all guidelines and teachings for a life in the spirit of the Torah.
We discover that in many respects, both the law of the Mishnah and the form in which it records it is quite new. In my estimation, the Mishnah is far more new than it is old, far more innovative or even revolutionary, because it had to address a very, very revolutionary period, a period that was literally unprecedented. And therefore, it went forward in very bold ways, keeping what it could of the old, but forging ahead with the new in a very aggressive fashion.
The Mishnah helps devout Jews to live the laws of the Torah in everyday life. So too with the dietary laws known as kashrut, that prescribe what can be eaten and what cannot. The Jews differentiate between kosher, pure, and trefa, impure. This holds for all food and its preparation. One of the many laws of the Torah is, "Thou shalt not seethe a kid in his mother's milk." For the family from Jerusalem, that means that they mustn't cook and eat milk and meat together. At their table, there is no meal that combines these two. For the kitchen, this means separate fridges, sinks, tablecloths, pots and cutlery. In the Jewish kindergarten Gan Israel in Berlin, two kitchen areas are completely separated because of this. On the left, they prepare milky things, and on the right, meaty things. Amongst animals, they also distinguish between pure and impure. Kosher are fish with scales, most poultry, and cloven-hoofed animals that chew the cud.
You will find many, many Jews who don't care very much about kashrut at all, who will refuse to eat pork or other pig products, because this became a very powerful symbol of what Jews shouldn't eat. And even today, for those who don't care about the technicalities of the law, when Jews want to eat as Jews, that sometimes means something as simple as not eating the product of the pig.
Kashrut also applies to drinks. Wine grower Christopher König from Alsace produces kosher wine. He's regularly visited by Gabi Jalosinski, a rabbi from Strasbourg who checks every production step. He alone is allowed to break the seal of the barrels. Because wine is only kosher when no non-Jew has come into contact with it. The Strasbourg congregation needs wine for ritual purposes and also trades in it. 2% of the proceeds go to the needy. That's another condition for the kosher label. We are a people of traditions. Respect of traditions is what mainly allowed the Jewish people to continue to exist to this day. If one were to try to modernize or modify our traditions, it would be the downfall of the Jewish people, even if you can sometimes ask yourself if they make sense. After the loss of Jerusalem and the Temple, the Torah and the Mishnah become important sources of identity. The Jews are now a nation without a land, but their writings ensure their unity as a religious community. Once a people of the Temple, they are now a people of the writings. Abba is appointed rabbi. Now he is allowed to make decisions in ritual questions and civil judgments. Thus distinguished, he returns to Babylon. He wants to bring his knowledge to the Jews of his homeland. When his teacher, Judah Hanassi, dies at the beginning of the 3rd century, the sorrow for the famous rabbi is great. He is buried in the necropolis of Bet Shirim. After Jerusalem, it's one of the most important Jewish cemeteries. Many have themselves buried here right into the Middle Ages in the soil of the Holy Land. The mortal remains are brought from far away, from Syria, the Lebanon, Egypt, and Babylon. Abba returns to his Babylonian home. Many Jewish communities have been in existence here for 700 years. Abba's destinations are the great centers of Jewish teaching on the Euphrates: Pumbeditha, Nahadia, and Sura. In Sura, the Jewish scholar founds an academy that's soon known as the Little Shrine. Abba makes the laws and rules from Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, known in Babylon. He's now called Rav, teacher of the entire Diaspora. His authority is generally accepted. Soon the schools in Babylon surpass those of the old homeland. Together with other scholars, Abba writes a great work that will shape Jewish religion to this day. In its current form, the Babylonian Talmud, as it's called, contains 6,000 pages and addresses questions of all areas of life. It is made up of the Mishnah and commentaries from nearly 3,000 rabbis from 3 continents. A page resembles the cross-section of a tree trunk. In its center is the Mishnah, around it, like growth rings on trees, the commentaries from 7 centuries. Keep turning it, because everything is contained within it. Thus, it is written in the Talmud. Even in foreign lands, it is a kind of portable homeland for Jews that they want to have close to them. Everywhere in the world, be it New York, Jerusalem, or here in Frankfurt, students and teachers are studying and discussing in the Talmud schools. How is a certain law in the Torah to be understood, and how is it applied in practice? What does Rabbi Hillel write, and what does Rabbi Shammai say to this? This way, the Talmud secures the religious laws, keeps the teaching alive, and makes their further development possible.
The joke, the later knowing joke, which says that if you have, 2 Jews, at least 2 opinions, probably 3, there's no doubt in my mind that the Jewish inclination toward argument originates in the Talmud. There is a culture of argument in the Talmud which is very powerful. The Talmud recognizes, I believe, that there's no single truth, that we don't know exactly what God wants of us, so it's important to argue. What does God want of us? And different opinions might be equally legitimate, and the Talmud pursues those opinions by and large as though they are legitimate. And when we get to the end of the Talmud, while sometimes decisions are made, very, very often the arguments with which the Talmud began are precisely the same arguments with which it ends, the only difference being we now recognize why each of the different opinions is a good opinion.
After its creation, the Talmud soon comes to other communities. The text promotes the spiritual union of the dispersed people. At the end of the 6th century, a new power enters the stage of world history: Islam. The founder of the new religion is the Arabian merchant Muhammad. His visions and revelations are written down in the Quran. Muhammad dreams of a great religion that Jews and Christians are meant to follow too. When these don't accept him as a prophet, he changes his attitude. At first, he had wanted to make Jerusalem the religious center of Islam, but he now decides on his own birthplace, Mecca. After the death of Muhammad, his successors conquer the Arabian Peninsula, and soon the Islamic Empire stretches right into North Africa. In 638 AD, Allah's warriors also conquered Jerusalem and renew the prohibition against Jews living in the city. As a symbol of their rule, the Muslims erect the Mosque of Omar on the Temple Mount. Here, Muhammad is said to have risen to heaven with his horse. After Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem also becomes a holy place of Islam.
The Arabic Empire, or Islamic Empire, was prosperous and powerful. We often don't realize that between the 8th and the 12th or 13th century, it was the focal point of culture and wealth for the entire Western world. The Jews were part of that, so they quite naturally prospered along with it, and they achieved the kind of cultural level that went along with being part of a very culturally sophisticated environment.
For the first time since the fall of the temple, most Jews are once again living in a single cultural, political, and economic unit. They are allowed to move around freely in the country and practice their religion as long as they abide by the law. Because for the Muslim ruler, they are a people of the book and thus dhimmis, protected persons, as it is written in the Quran. Those who injure a dhimmi injure me, and those who injure me have injured Allah. But they don't have the same rights. Jews are not allowed to ride horses or camels, and they're not allowed to bear arms. Whenever they meet a Muslim, they have to greet him reverently. Islam's economic and intellectual metropolis is Baghdad. The city becomes an important cultural and religious center for Jews too. Even in 1948, a quarter of Baghdad's population is still Jewish. 3 years later, hundreds of thousands of Jews are expelled from Iraq into the newly founded state of Israel. Right into modern times, the Jews were influential citizens with a largely autonomous administration. At the same time, Baghdad is an important religious reference point for Jews in the entire Muslim region. The advice of the Gaon, the leader of the Jewish community, carries weight.
According to what we are told, when the head of the Jewish community in Baghdad came to the palace for an audience with the caliph, a crier would run ahead of him to clear the streets and say in Arabic, "Make way for the son of David who is coming to see the caliph." It may be an imaginary picture, but it's a very charming one because it illustrates the high status that the leader of the Jewish community had as a kind of a quasi-royalty in the Islamic world. Given that background, the religious leadership of the Jewish community of Baghdad became the religious leadership of the Islamic world, which meant for practical purposes the whole Jewish world, since 95% of the Jewish population of the world lived in Arabic-speaking Islamic territories.
Internal Jewish disputes are also argued in the presence of the caliph. For example, the central Jewish confrontation of the Middle Ages. The leader of the Jews in Babylon, the Gaon, disputes with the leader of the Academy in Jerusalem for the right to determine the time of the new moon. Finally, Babylon wins through. The argument is of great significance because the Jewish calendar is based on the lunar cycle. The new moon always falls on the first day of the month. The person who determines the time of the new moon makes decisions about the calendar and therefore also decides when Jews all around the world keep their festivals. In 711 AD, Islam reaches Europe. The armies of the Moors and the Berbers conquer the Iberian Peninsula. They will not finally be dislodged for nearly 800 years. Many Jews welcome the Muslim conquerors. They've been settled here since Roman times and proudly call themselves Sephardim, after the Hebrew word for Spain. They're hoping for an end to the oppression by the Christian rulers. Cordoba becomes the capital of Muslim Andalusia and the most important center of Jewish life. One of the most famous Jewish philosophers is born here in 1135 AD, Moses ben Maimon, who is also called Maimonides. On his monument in the former Jewish quarter it says, "From Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses." Even as a child, Maimonides displayed his insatiable thirst for knowledge. He was fascinated by his father's library, scriptures, Greek philosophers, scientific treatises, and Arabic poetry. Later, Maimonides wrote, "I devoured every book belonging to my father, bless him, that I could lay my hands on." His father is his first teacher. He works at the rabbinical court and studies under the most famous intellectuals. During the lifetime of Maimonides, Cordoba, the Pearl of Al-Andalus, embodies everything that once defined Islamic Spain. The third largest mosque in the world, the Mezquita, was built here in the 8th century. It speaks of friendly and fruitful coexistence of the different religions. The Caliphate style combines Roman, Gothic, Byzantine, Syrian and Persian elements. This was the origin of medieval Moorish architecture in Spain. The Caliph's openness draws poets and intellectuals to Cordoba from all around the world. The city is also the spiritual home of Maimonides. Throughout his life he would say, "Here with us in Al-Andalus." The quarter in which the Jews live is called La Juderia in Spanish. Here is one of the oldest still extant synagogues in Spain. Like all synagogues, it's not directly accessible from the street, but only through a small inner courtyard. The architecture of the building, which was constructed in 1315 AD, shows how well the Jews adapted to their Muslim surroundings. Maimonides' father doesn't just open up the world of scripture to his son, but also the world of the practically applied sciences. Andalusia is a rich source of information for the curious boy because it's one of the most significant centers of art and science. Long before the Christians, Arab scholars adopt the knowledge of the ancient Greeks. Arabs develop instruments that have been known since ancient times, astrolabes, instruments used for determining the position of celestial bodies and calculating the time. Moorish Spain plays an important role in the rebirth of ancient knowledge. It's the interface between Arabic culture and Christian Europe. As the Middle Ages progress, it is from Andalusia that the knowledge of the ancient world spreads across Europe. Medicine and botany also reach new heights. Jews take over knowledge and skills and develop them further. It is often they who introduce the new methods and the knowledge to Europe.
Jews bore Arabic names and read Arabic books, and they became cultured in the way that Arabs were cultured, which meant that they acquired a knowledge of Arabic literature and of the sciences, because these scientific works, Greek scientific works, very quickly became available in Arabic. And having one language from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, information could pass quickly and easily. And like the rest of the Mediterranean, the Jews were brought together into one large cultural entity.
The largely peaceful coexistence ends in 1147. A radical Muslim sect, the Almohads, comes to the Iberian Peninsula from Maghreb. They demand that all those of other faiths convert to Islam. Many Jews flee from the Almohads to the Christian north of Spain, or they try to escape to northern Africa. Maimonides and his family have to flee too. Christians and Jews are both faced by a stark choice: convert or emigrate. Later, Maimonides writes, "A Jew has to leave a country when he is forced to break the divine law. Under no circumstances should he stay in a place where he would be forced to convert. Whoever stays in such a place desecrates the divine name." The family is on the run for the next 10 years. They settle in Fez, in modern-day Morocco. During the Middle Ages, the town is considered an important cultural centre of the Islamic world. It doesn't look very different now from what it looked like then. Even the craftsmen work just as they did when Maimonides was alive. He's said to have lived in this house in the Rue des Horloges. A good 200 years later, most of North Africa's Jews were living in this quarter. In Arabic, it's called Mela, because the soil here is particularly salty. Until a few decades ago, there were synagogues, communal kitchens, ritual baths and schools. Fez was a famous Jewish centre. Between 1950 and 1980, many Jews left Morocco. Only 2 synagogues have survived. In one of them, Habanim, there is a small Jewish museum. Edmund Gabay collects everything linked with Jewish life in Fez. In this museum, the synagogue comes alive again in my heart. We studied here, we prayed here. When we were young, there was a canteen here in which we ate. There were important rabbis. We lived through the whole decline. Every time when I look at something, it reminds me of what happened between the time of my youth and today. The heyday of the Jews in Fez seems to be over. Around 1950, 30,000 Jews still lived here. Today it's only some 300. When the Almohads seized the power in Fez too, a new period of religious oppression begins for the Maimon family. From now on, it's convert to Islam or die. Maimonides witnesses the execution of the chief rabbi of Fez. He'd refused to forswear his faith. Maimonides and his family have no option but to flee again. This time they embark on a very long and dangerous journey. First they spend 28 days on a ship, and then they continue on foot. They settle in Al-Fustat in Egypt. At the time it was a suburb of Cairo, the capital of the Muslim rulers in Egypt. By 1100 AD, 7,000 Jews from all around the world have settled here. There are 3 Jewish congregations in Fustat. Each has its own synagogue. Maimonides is said to have prayed in the Ben Ezra synagogue. According to legend, this is where Moses had drifted ashore in a basket as a baby. The Jews bought the land and built a synagogue on this biblical site. During renovation works at the end of the 19th century, a sensational discovery came to light. In the interior, they found a storage room for old manuscripts. Many synagogues have such a geneza, as it's called, because it's the custom not to destroy manuscripts that contain God's name. But this was the first time that documents were found that date back to the early Middle Ages. In Cambridge, the specialist for Talmud studies, Salomon Schechter, heard about the unique discovery. For weeks he studied the documents in Cairo and selected those of scholarly interest. Finally, he filled over 30 bags and boxes with material from the geneza. He took his spectacular loot to Cambridge. It's still in the university library. 140,000 fragments, religious texts, letters, poems, wedding documents, children's drawings, recipes, checks, and even writings by Maimonides. They give an insight into nearly 1,000 years of Jewish history, into not just the religious, but also the everyday life of the Jews. Because of this discovery, the Jewish congregation in Cairo is the best documented of all the Jewish communities in the Islamic world of the Middle Ages. Another important part of the Geneza collection found its way to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Here, the medieval specialist Mark R. Cohen has been researching its secrets for over 30 years. He inspected the manuscripts for the university and put the numerous fragments together in a meaningful way. It's detective work. He's particularly fascinated by Maimonides' private letters.
We begin to understand how Maimonides acted as a real person in actual life. He was a man of the community, not just a man of letters. He was the centrally most important scholar and leader in the Jewish community of Egypt in the second half of the 12th century.
To earn his living, Maimonides works as a doctor. He wants to comprehend God as much as is humanly possible. Alongside the other sciences, medicine is one of the most exquisite God-serving occupations, a widespread view amongst Jewish intellectuals, many of whom also work as doctors. Because of his expert knowledge, he is summoned to court by Grand Vizier Al-Fadil as his personal physician. Maimonides visits his patient nearly every day in his palace in Cairo, where he also treats the women of the harem. In a letter that was also found in the Geniza, he described a typical day. I live in Fustat, and the ruler resides in Cairo, which is about 2 Sabbath journeys away. My duties to him are hard. I have to visit him every day, and that early in the morning. If he or one of his children or one of the harem women are unwell, I don't dare leave Cairo. I have to remain in the palace for the larger part of the day. At night, I am so tired that I can hardly speak. That's why no Israelite can have a private conversation with me except on the Sabbath. Besides working as a doctor, he composed the Mishneh Torah and the Guide for the Confused, a manual for Jews all around the world. It was his goal that every Jew should understand the fundamentals of the oral teachings and be able to live according to the traditions. Maimonides died on the 13th of December 1204 at the age of 69. In Jewish communities all around the world, they mourn his death. Even today, he's considered one of the greatest Jewish intellectuals and the most outstanding representative of the Sephardim, the Spanish Jews. For the Jews in Maimonides' home country, Spain, though, a new era has already begun. Christian rulers reconquer the Muslim cities. The Sephardic Jews are faced by a new challenge in their confrontation with Christianity.